Now read a second time. I call the member for Hotham.
Thank you so much, Deputy Speaker, and it's a real pleasure to be able to make a contribution to this discussion today, and it is a really important one. I note that it's been the practice of the debate so far to refer only tangentially to the legislation that's actually being debated today in the House, and so I'm going to take a pretty novel approach and actually talk about the bills that we are discussing today. They're really important ones. Ones that protect truck drivers in this country and ones that protect all of us who share the roads with those people driving trucks. Deputy Speaker, I'm aware that there's probably some confusion out there about exactly what it is that we're debating today, because a few weeks ago no one outside of the trucking industry had probably ever heard of the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal. Certainly we hadn't heard much from the federal government about it, even though the order that's under discussion today was made in December last year. Deputy Speaker, just for the purposes of helping people understand what it is that we're discussing, this is a remuneration tribunal that was set up to set rates and terms of pay for truck drivers in our country. And the reason that it was established, Deputy Speaker, is because there are extremely clear links between the rates and conditions that truck drivers work under and their safety practices on the road. And I'll talk a little bit about the very clear links and the clear evidence that we see from studies that have been done all over the world. Deputy Speaker, some time ago this tribunal made a decision about rates of pay that owner-operators of trucking companies in this country have told us that they're going to find very difficult to implement. And we're very happy to sit down and talk about how we can resolve that discussion. But instead, 4 months after this decision was made by the tribunal, the federal government has come really out of nowhere and said, well, that's it, we're going to abolish this tribunal without any public discussion. Deputy Speaker, for that reason we're opposed to this measure. It's a complete overreaction to the order that was given by the tribunal, and as I've said, the tribunal is actually a very important one. It performs a really important role in protecting drivers and protecting all of us on the road. Deputy Speaker, one of the really essential features of living in such a big country with a small population is that trucking is still a way that goods are moved around. It's just a fact of life for us in Australia. Anyone who's driving on the Hume Highway, the Murray Valley, on the southeastern, out in my neck of the woods in Melbourne, is going to be sharing that road with people who are doing long-haul driving and who are driving trucks that can cause serious damage if accidents happen. Now, we see the evidence of the additional danger of having a road system like this very clearly. Deputy Speaker, if there's one thing that I want people to remember coming out of the discussion today, it is that truck drivers are 12 times more likely to die at work than ordinary Australians. This is actually the biggest death rate of any industry in this country. It's actually one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, Deputy Speaker. Now, something else that everyone should remember is that last month alone, 25 people died in trucking accidents. And, Deputy Speaker, what is crucial to understand about this is that of those 25 people, many were not truck drivers. So although this is called the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, and though it deals specifically with truck drivers, the reality is this is a piece of legislation that protects all of us, because we do share the roads with people who are truck drivers. Now, Deputy Speaker, for all the reasons that I've just described, this tribunal was set up in 2012, and the critical role of it is to set rates and conditions for truck drivers around this country. The reason that the tribunal was established, Deputy Speaker, is because, as I mentioned, there are extremely clear links between the rates of pay and the conditions of truck drivers and their safety on the road. And in all these debates, the best thing for us to do is to go back to the evidence. And I say to people who are interested in this issue, don't listen to those on the other side, don't even listen to us when it comes to evidence. Try to find an authoritative source, and we have a really good one. The Conversation website, which, as most would know, has as its core business checking facts that are used by politicians, has looked into this link between rates of pay and safety on the roads in recent weeks. And what it has found, Deputy Speaker, and I'm quoting from the upshot of their review, is that, quote, there is persuasive evidence of a connection between truck driver pay and safety. Deputy Speaker, the evidence that the Conversation considered when it looked at this critical question about the links between pay and road safety came from a series of studies that have been done, in particular in Australia and in the US, which, like Australia, is very dependent on trucks as a way to move goods around the country. So some of the studies that have been done in Australia, Deputy Speaker, very clearly show that the amount and the way in particular that drivers are being paid significantly affects their sleepiness And in addition, Deputy Speaker, the speed at which they travel, a crucial issue for safety on the road. In fact, one study, Deputy Speaker, talked about different methods of paying truck drivers, that when they're paid on a per-trip basis, truck drivers drive 15 kilometres faster on average. That is a serious amount of speed that truck drivers are using to get around when they're using this type of payment system. Deputy Speaker, the conversation looked at some international studies, and one that I do want to mention is a pretty substantial American study that was done by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And what that study looked at was long-haul drivers, so drivers who are doing interstate travel mainly. And what they found was that driver pay had a significant effect on safety on the job. And it wasn't just looking at things like the outcomes, for example, people being injured in accidents, Deputy Speaker, but it was looking at the practices that those drivers had to adopt when they were being paid not enough to keep themselves going, to keep their families going. So things like use of drugs to stay awake and to stay alert, undertaking excessive hours, speeding, working for longer than the safe number of hours, were all things that were associated with lower rates of pay. So there's some really good evidence out there about this question, Deputy Speaker, and again I'd encourage those who are interested in understanding this issue a little bit more to have a look at the Conversations review of this. But I would just make the point, Deputy Speaker, that all these studies show us something that's pretty simple and pretty logical, and that is that if people are not getting paid enough to make a living, to support their families, then they're going to have to do things that make their incomes higher. If their rates of pay, if the rates of pay of truck drivers are set too low for them to make a living using safe practices, people are more likely to use unsafe practices. That's just the logic of how this operates. So, Deputy Speaker, just thinking about what this is about. So I talked a little bit about fatalities when I opened the discussion today, and this is absolutely about truck driver safety. But, Deputy Speaker, it is also about those of us that share the roads with people who are driving trucks. And the reality is that all of us have family in this chamber, or all of us represent people who use our roads. And I know as a parent I don't want to put children in a car knowing that we will be driving down the freeway next to someone who has had to adopt unsafe driving practices just so they can make a living. That's just completely inappropriate in a country like Australia, where we are so dependent on our roads as a means to get around, Deputy Speaker. Now, based on what I've said, of course, the question is, why would the government want to abolish something like this? And of course, there's a complication that the industry and the government are going to need to deal with. I mentioned that the Tribunal has made a decision that threatens the viability of some owner-operators, and that is a very serious issue. Of course, we don't want to have a tribunal that puts out of work truck drivers, that puts under threat businesses that have been going concerns for long periods of time. And I respect the people who have come to Canberra to talk to us about this issue, who have seen generations upon generations of people and their family driving trucks, and who see the order that was given by the Tribunal as a threat to their livelihoods. And there is a lot of sympathy for the people who are in that position, Deputy Speaker, and Labor wants to talk with them and to represent them in this parliament. It's not, though, Deputy Speaker, a good reason to abolish a tribunal. Tribunals make decisions all the time. Just because we don't like one of them or it isn't suitable for the current commercial context, it doesn't mean that we abolish the tribunal. So what would a good government do in the face of such a challenge? Well, I think a good government would sit down with the relevant parties, with the drivers, with the owner-operators, with the big trucking companies who, as it turns out in question time today, are also very concerned about this, and with the union representatives who represent many of these drivers, and discuss how it is that this can be managed. I don't think anyone wants to be bloody-minded about this. The point of this tribunal is, of course, not to threaten the viability of businesses. It's to try to make us safe on our roads, and if the balance hasn't been gotten quite right there, let's address that situation. But, Deputy Speaker, it is not a reason to abolish this tribunal, and this is a good piece of public policy that is based in really good evidence, and we should support it and modify it if needs be. But I definitely don't believe that what's happened is grounds to abolish the tribunal altogether. Deputy Speaker, I think the reality that we face here is that the attempt to abolish the tribunal has been very reactionary, and it's really come out of nowhere from a decision that was made many months ago. Actually, in mid-last year, a question was asked to the Deputy Prime Minister about whether the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal would be abolished, and the government said, no, we're not going to go down that path. We don't think there'll be public support for such a proposal. So, Deputy Speaker, I guess the question for us is why, out of nowhere, has this suddenly become such an urgent national priority, something that the government wasn't talking about at all a couple of weeks ago? Suddenly they've got people on the phone trying to drum up protests and all this sort of thing. So why would the government be doing this? And I think it's a really good example of the current situation that the government's in, Deputy Speaker. What we see on the other side of the House on issue to issue is a government that is in search of a mission. And I have to say, as a Member of Parliament, it is staggering to me that a group of people who've worked their whole lives to be in a government just like this one get there and have no idea what they want to do with that political power. I mean, what has the member for Wentworth been doing for the last years that he's been a Member of Parliament but thinking about what he might do if he ever got to be Prime Minister? And yet what we see, Deputy Speaker, is he gets into the role, probably a lifelong dream for him, and he's frozen. He can't create an agenda. He can't think of what his government should stand for. So we see him sadly, very sadly, grasping at issue to issue. Some of the journalists in the press gallery are calling this government by thought bubble, because from week to week the ogre against our economic growth in this country changes. We saw it in we've seen the tax mix being at one stage the big problem facing the country. Then we had the structure of the federation. We've had the union movement as the big issue. We've had tax burden on the middle class, then tax burden on companies, and we need to get something resolved here. One of the things that's really notable out there in my electorate at the moment, and I'm sure other members of Parliament are hearing this, is that whether I'm talking to people who are senior in business or people who are on a street corner who've come to talk to me about a local issue, they are all saying the same thing, and that is that they want leadership. It is almost a question of just lead us somewhere, just in one direction, just for a few months so we understand what this government is about. But instead, from week to week to week, we just get a different story and a different set of objectives from this Prime Minister and his Treasurer. Now, Deputy Speaker, politics is politics, so I'm not going to get too upset about a piece of legislation coming before us that perhaps wouldn't be prioritised under other circumstances. But I have to say one thing that I'm finding very frustrating about the current situation is that the country actually faces hugely significant problems that need the attention of the National Parliament. We have an education system that is falling behind education systems around the world. For the first time in as long as we've known, children who are living in Australia right now are getting a lesser quality of education than children who are living in Shanghai. This is a crucial national problem and something on which the government has nothing to say. We have a healthcare system that is under pressure from an ageing population. We've got a standard of living in this country that has not improved for 5 years, Deputy Speaker. Now, these are problems that are worthy of recalling the National Parliament. But we're all here. We've got here the whole House of Representatives, the whole Senate. We've gone through the charade of going into the Senate and hearing the Governor-General give another address. What an absolute farce this has been. And we're doing it because the government just can't think of anything better to do. It's brought us here to talk about pieces of legislation that for sure are important. They raise issues that matter to many Australians. But, Deputy Speaker, if you think that the bills that are being debated in the upper house at the moment are the most important issues facing the country, then that just shows how out of touch you are. So, Deputy Speaker, I am standing with Labor today. We will not be supporting the repeal of this tribunal. And the reason that we're not supporting the repeal of this tribunal, apart from the craven manner in which this has been done, is because this tribunal actually performs a crucially important role. It's called the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal because it's about road safety. It's about protecting truck drivers who are 12 times more likely to die on the roads than Australians who work in other industries. And it's about protecting you, Deputy Speaker, the people at home and me when I'm on the road with my family, because I don't want to be on those roads thinking that I might be driving next to a truck driver who has had to work too long hours, had to skip his breaks, had to use drugs or caffeine, other things to keep him awake, just so that he can make a living for him and his family. It's not fair, it's not good for road safety, and it's not something that Labor will support.
I thank the member.